Quarter of the town, however, scarcely any shortcoming in dress would have created surprise. Owing to the proximity of the Haymarket, the number of establishments of bad character, the preponderance of trading and working-class population crowded in these streets and alleys in the heart of St. Petersburg, types so various were to be seen in the streets that no figure, however queer, would have caused surprise. But there was such accumulated bitterness and contempt in the young man's heart that, in spite of all the fastidiousness of youth, he minded his rags least of all in the street. It was a different matter when he met with acquaintances or with former fellow students, whom, indeed, he disliked meeting at any time. And yet when a drunken man who, for some unknown reason, was being taken somewhere in a huge wagon dragged by a heavy dray horse, suddenly shouted at him as he drove past, "Hey there, German hatter!" Bawling at the top of his voice and pointing at him, the young man stopped suddenly and clutched tremulously at his hat. It was a tall, round hat from Zimmermann's, but completely worn out, rusty with age, all torn and bespattered, brimless, and bent on one side in most unseemly fashion. Not shame, however, but quite another feeling akin to terror had overtaken him. "I knew it," he muttered in confusion. "I thought so. That's the worst of all. Why, a stupid thing like this, the most trivial detail, might spoil the whole plan. Yes, my hat is too noticeable. It looks absurd, and that makes it noticeable. With my rags I ought to wear a cap, a sort of old pancake, but not this grotesque thing. Nobody wears such a hat. It would be noticed a mile off. It would be remembered. What matters is that people would remember it, and that would give them a clue. For this business one should be as little conspicuous as possible. Trifles are what matter. Why, it's just such trifles that always ruin everything." He had not far to go. He knew indeed how many steps it was from the gate of his lodging-house, exactly 730. He'd counted them once, when he had been lost in dreams. At the time he had put no faith in those dreams and was only tantalizing himself by their hideous but daring recklessness. Now, a month later, he had begun to look upon them differently, and in spite of the monologue in which he jeered at his own impotence and indecision, he had involuntarily come to regard this hideous dream as an exploit to be attempted, although he still did not realize this himself. He was positively going now for a rehearsal of his project, and at every step his excitement grew more and more violent. With a sinking heart and a nervous tremor, he went out to a huge house which on one side looked onto the canal and on the other into the street. This house was let out in tiny tenements and was inhabited by working people of all sorts: tailors, locksmiths, cooks, Germans of sorts, girls picking up a living as best they could, petty clerks, etc. There was a continual coming and going through the two gates and in the two courtyards of the house. 4 doorkeepers were employed on the building. The young man was very glad to meet none of them, and at once slipped unnoticed through the door on the right and up the staircase. It was a back staircase, dark and narrow, but he was familiar with it already and knew his way, and he liked all these surroundings. In such darkness, even the most inquisitive eyes were not to be dreaded. "If I am so scared now, what would it be if it somehow came to pass that I were really going to do it?" he could not help asking himself as he reached the 4th story. There his progress was barred by some porters who were engaged in moving furniture out of a flat. He knew that the flat had been occupied by a German clerk in the civil service and his family. This German was moving out then, and so the 4th floor on this staircase would be untenanted except by the old woman. "That's a good thing, anyway," he thought to himself as he rang the bell of the old woman's flat. The bell gave a faint tinkle, as though it were made of tin and not of copper. The little flats in such houses always have such bells that ring like that. He had forgotten the note of that bell, and now its peculiar tinkle seemed to remind him of something and to bring it clearly before him. He started. His nerves were terribly overstrained by now. In a little while the door was opened a tiny crack. The old woman eyed her visitor with evident distrust through the crack, and nothing could be seen but her little eyes glittering in the darkness. But seeing a number of people on the landing, she grew bolder and opened the door wide. The young man stepped into the dark entry, which was partitioned off from the tiny kitchen. The old woman stood facing him in silence and looking inquiringly at him. She was a diminutive, withered-up old woman of 60, with sharp, malignant eyes and a sharp little nose. Her colourless, somewhat grizzled hair was thickly smeared with oil, and she wore no kerchief over it. Round her thin, long neck, which looked like a hen's leg, was knotted some sort of flannel rag, and in spite of the heat there hung flapping on her shoulders a mangy fur cape, yellow with age. The old woman coughed and groaned at every instant. The young man must have looked at her with a rather peculiar expression, for a gleam of mistrust came into her eyes again. "Raskolnikov, a student. I came here a month ago," the young man made haste to mutter, with a half-bow, remembering that he ought to be more polite. "I remember, my good sir. I remember quite well your coming here," the old woman said distinctly, still keeping her inquiring eyes on his face. "And here I am again on the same errand," Raskolnikov continued, a little disconcerted and surprised at the old woman's mistrust. "Perhaps she's always like that, though. Only I did not notice it the other time," he thought with an uneasy feeling. The old woman paused, as though hesitating, then stepped on one side, and pointing to the door of the room, she said, letting her visitor pass in front of her, "Step in, my good sir." The little room into which the young man walked, with yellow paper on the walls, geraniums and muslin curtains in the windows, was brightly lighted up at that moment by the setting sun. In the corner a light was burning before a small icon. Everything was very clean. The door and the furniture were brightly polished. Everything shone. Lizaveta's work, thought the young man. There was not a speck of dust to be seen in the whole flat. It's in the houses of spiteful old women that one finds such cleanliness, Raskolnikov thought again, and he stole a curious glance at the cotton curtain over the door leading into another tiny room in which he had never looked before. These two rooms made up the whole flat. "What do you want?" the old woman said severely, coming into the room, and, as before, standing in front of him so as to look him straight in the face. "I've brought something to pawn here," and he drew out of his pocket an old-fashioned flat silver watch, on the back of which was engraved a globe. The chain was of steel. "But the time is up for your last pledge. The month was up the day before yesterday. I will bring you the interest for another month. Wait a little." "But that's for me to do as I please, my good sir, to wait or to sell your pledge at once." "How much will you give me for the watch, Alyona Ivanovna?" "You come with such trifles, my good sir. It's scarcely worth anything. I gave you 2 rubles last time for your ring, and one could buy it quite new at a jeweller's for 1.5 rubles. Give me 4 rubles for it. I shall redeem it. It was my father's. I shall be getting some money soon." 1.5 rubles, and interest in advance, if you like." 1.5 rubles, cried the young man. "Please yourself." And the old woman handed him back the watch. The young man took it and was so angry that he was on the point of going away, but checked himself at once, remembering that there was nowhere else he could go, and that he'd had another object also in coming. "Hand it over," he said roughly. The old woman fumbled in her pocket for her keys and disappeared behind the curtain into the other room. The young man, left standing alone in the middle of the room, listened inquisitively, thinking. He could hear her unlocking the chest of drawers. "It must be the top drawer," he reflected. "So she carries the keys in a pocket on the right, all in one bunch on a steel ring. And there's one key there 3 times as big as all the others, with deep notches. That can't be the key of the chest of drawers. Then there must be some other chest or strong box. That's worth knowing. Strong boxes always have keys like that. But how degrading it all is." The old woman came back. "Here, sir. As we say 10 kopecks the ruble a month, so I must take 15 kopecks from 1.5 rubles for the month in advance. But for the 2 rubles I lent you before, you owe me now 20 kopecks on the same reckoning in advance. That makes 35 kopecks altogether. So I must give you 1 ruble and 15 kopecks for the watch. Here it is. What, only 1 ruble and 15 kopecks now? Just so. The young man did not dispute it and took the money. He looked at the old woman and was in no hurry to get away, as though there was still something he wanted to say or to do, but he did not himself quite know what. I may be bringing you something else in a day or two, Alyona Ivanovna. A valuable thing, silver, a cigarette box, as soon as I can get it back from a friend. He broke off in confusion. Well, we will talk about it then, sir. Goodbye. Are you always at home alone? Your sister's not here with you? He asked her as casually as possible as he went out into the passage. What business is she of yours, my good sir? Oh, no, nothing particular. I simply asked. You're too quick. Good day, Alyona Ivanovna. Raskolnikov went out in complete confusion. This confusion became more and more intense. As he went down the stairs, he even stopped short 2 or 3 times, as though suddenly struck by some thought. When he was in the street, he cried out, "Oh, God, how loathsome it all is! And can I possibly... Oof. No, it's nonsense, it's rubbish," he added resolutely. "And how could such an atrocious thing come into my head? What filthy things my heart is capable of. Yes, filthy above all, disgusting, loathsome. And for a whole month I've been..." But no words, no exclamations could express his agitation. The feeling of intense repulsion, which had begun to oppress and torture his heart while he was on his way to the old woman, had by now reached such a pitch and had taken such a definite form that he did not know what to do with himself to escape from his wretchedness. On returning from the Haymarket, he flung himself on the sofa and sat for a whole hour without stirring. Meanwhile, it got dark. He had no candle, and indeed it did not occur to him to light up. He could never recollect whether he had been thinking about anything at that time. At last he was conscious of his former fever and shivering, and he realized with relief that he could lie down on the sofa. Soon heavy, leaden sleep came over him, as it were, crushing him. Suddenly he heard a clock strike. He started, roused himself, raised his head, looked out of the window, and seeing how late it was, suddenly jumped up, wide awake, as though someone had pulled him off the sofa. He crept on tiptoe to the door, stealthily opened it, and began listening on the staircase. His heart beat terribly. But all was quiet on the stairs, as if everyone was asleep. It seemed to him strange and monstrous that he could have slept in such forgetfulness from the previous day, and had done nothing, had prepared nothing yet, and meanwhile perhaps it had struck 6, and his drowsiness and stupefaction were followed by an extraordinary, feverish, as it were, distracted haste. But the preparations to be made were few. He concentrated all his energies on thinking of everything and forgetting nothing, and his heart kept beating and thumping so that he could hardly breathe. First he had to make a noose and sew it into his overcoat, a work of a moment. He rummaged under his pillow and picked out amongst the linen stuffed away under it a worn, old, unwashed shirt. From its rags he tore a long strip, a couple of inches wide and about 16 inches long. He folded this strip in 2, took off his wide, strong summer overcoat of some stout cotton material, his only outer garment, and began sewing the 2 ends of the rag on the inside under the left armhole. His hands shook as he sewed, but he did it successfully so that nothing showed outside when he put the coat on again. The needle and thread he had got ready long before, and they lay on his table in a piece of paper. As for the noose, it was a very ingenious device of his own. The noose was intended for the axe. It was impossible for him to carry the axe through the street in his hands, and if hidden under his coat, he would still have had to support it with his hand, which would have been noticeable. Now he had only to put the head of the axe in the noose, and it would hang quietly under his arm on the inside. Putting his hand in his coat pocket, He could hold the end of the handle all the way so that it did not swing. And as the coat was very full, a regular sack, in fact, it could not be seen from the outside that he was holding something with his hand that was in the pocket. This noose, too, he had desired a fortnight before. When he had finished with this, he thrust his hand into a little opening between his sofa and the floor, fumbled in the left corner, and drew out the pledge, which he had got ready long before and hidden there. This pledge was, however, only a smoothly planed piece of wood, the size and thickness of a silver cigarette case. He picked up this piece of wood in one of his wanderings in a courtyard, where there was some sort of a workshop. Afterwards he had added to the wood a thin, smooth piece of iron, which he had also picked up at the same time in the street. At first, long before, indeed, he had been much occupied with one question: why almost all crimes are so badly concealed and so easily detected, and why almost all criminals leave such obvious traces. He had come gradually to many different and curious conclusions, and in his opinion the chief reason lay not so much in the material impossibility of concealing the crime as in the criminal himself. Almost every criminal is subject to a failure of will and reasoning power by childish and phenomenal heedlessness at the very instant when prudence and caution are most essential. It was his conviction that this eclipse of reason and failure of willpower attacked a man like a disease, developed gradually and reached its highest point just before the perpetration of the crime, continued with equal violence at the moment of the crime and for longer or shorter time after, according to the individual case, and then passed off like any other disease. The question whether the disease gives rise to the crime or whether the crime, from its own peculiar nature, is always accompanied by something of the nature of a disease, he did not yet feel able to decide. When he reached these conclusions, he decided that in his own case there could not be such a morbid reaction, that his reason and will would remain unimpaired at the time of carrying out his design, for the simple reason that his design was not a crime. We will omit all the process by means of which he arrived at the last conclusion. We have run too far ahead already. We may add only that the practical, purely material difficulties of the affair occupied a secondary position in his mind. One has but to keep all one's willpower and reason to deal with them, and they will all be overcome at the time when once one has familiarized oneself with the minutest details of the business. But this preparation had never been begun. His final decisions were what he came to trust least, and when the hour struck, it all came to pass quite differently, as it were accidentally and unexpectedly. Glancing out of the corner of his eye into a shop, he saw by a clock on the wall that it was 10 minutes past 7. He had to make haste, and at the same time to go some way round, so as to approach the house from the other side. When he had happened to imagine all this beforehand, he had sometimes thought that he would be very much afraid, but he was not very much afraid now, was not afraid at all, indeed. His mind was even occupied by irrelevant matters, but by nothing for long. As he passed the Yusupov garden, he was deeply absorbed in considering the building of great fountains and of their refreshing effect on the atmosphere in all the squares. By degrees he passed to the conviction that if the summer garden were extended to the Field of Mars and perhaps joined to the garden of the Mikhailovsky Palace, it would be a splendid thing and a great benefit to the town. Then he was interested by the question why in all great towns men are not simply driven by necessity, but in some peculiar way inclined to live in those parts of the town where there are no gardens nor fountains, where there is most dirt and smell and all sorts of nastiness. Then his own walk through the Haymarket came back to his mind, and for a moment he waked up to reality. What nonsense, he thought. Better think of nothing at all. So, probably, men led to execution clutch mentally at every object that meets them on the way, flashed through his mind. But simply flashed like lightning. He made haste to dismiss this thought. And by now he was near. Here was the house, here was the gate. Suddenly a clock somewhere struck once. What, can it be 7:30? Impossible. It must be fast. Luckily for him, everything went well again at the gates. At that very moment, as though expressly for his benefit, a huge wagon of hay had just driven in at the gate, completely screening him as he passed under the gateway, and the wagon had scarcely had time to drive through into the yard before he had slipped in a flash to the right. On the other side of the wagon he could hear shouting and quarreling, but no one noticed him, no one met him. Many windows looking into that huge quadrangular yard were open at that moment, but he did not raise his head. He had not the strength to. The staircase leading to the old woman's room was close by, just on the right of the gateway. He was already on the stairs. Drawing a breath, pressing his hand against his throbbing heart, and once more feeling for the axe and setting it straight, he began softly and cautiously ascending the staircase, listening every minute. But the stairs, too, were quite deserted. All the doors were shut. He met no one. One flat, indeed, on the first floor was wide open, and painters were at work in it, but they did not glance at him. He stood still, thought a minute, and went on. Of course, it would have been better if they had not been here, but it's 2 stories above them. And here was the 4th story. Here was the door. Here was the flat opposite, the empty one. The flat underneath the old woman's was apparently empty also. The visiting card nailed on the door had been torn off. They had gone away. He was out of breath. For one instant the thought floated through his mind, shall I go back? But he made no answer and began listening at the old woman's door. A dead silence. Then he listened again on the staircase, listened long and intently. Then looked about him for the last time, pulled himself together, drew himself up, and once more tried the axe in the noose. Am I very pale? He wondered. Am I not evidently agitated? She is mistrustful. Had I better wait a little longer, till my heart leaves off thumping? But his heart did not leave off. On the contrary, as though to spite him, it throbbed more and more violently. He could stand it no longer. He slowly put out his hand to the bell and rang. Half a minute later he rang again, more loudly. No answer. To go on ringing was useless and out of place. The old woman was, of course, at home, but she was suspicious and alone. He had some knowledge of her habits, and once more he put his ear to the door. Either his senses were peculiarly keen, which is difficult to suppose, or the sound was really very distinct. Anyway, he suddenly heard something, like the cautious touch of a hand on the lock and the rustle of a skirt at the very door. Someone was standing stealthily close to the lock, and just as he was doing on the outside, was secretly listening within, and seemed to have her ear to the door. He moved a little on purpose and muttered something aloud that he might not have the appearance of hiding, then rang a 3rd time, but quietly, soberly, and without impatience. Recalling it afterwards, that moment stood out in his mind vividly, distinctly, forever. He could not make out how he had had such cunning, for his mind was, as it were, clouded at moments, and he was almost unconscious of his body. An instant later, he heard the latch unfastened. The door was, as before, opened a tiny crack, and again 2 sharp and suspicious eyes stared at him out of the darkness. Then Raskolnikov lost his head and nearly made a great mistake. Fearing the old woman would be frightened by their being alone, and not hoping that the sight of him would disarm her suspicions, he took hold of the door and drew it towards him to prevent the old woman from attempting to shut it again. Seeing this, she did not pull the door back, but she did not let go the handle, so that he almost dragged her out with it onto the stairs. Seeing that she was standing in the doorway, not allowing him to pass, he advanced straight upon her. She stepped back in alarm, tried to say something, but seemed unable to speak and stared with open eyes at him. "Good evening, Alyona Ivanovna," he began, trying to speak easily, but his voice would not obey him. It broke and shook. I have brought something. We'd better come in to the light." And leaving her, he passed straight into the room uninvited. The old woman ran after him. Her tongue was unloosed. "Good heavens, what is it? Who is it? What do you want?" "Why, Alyona Ivanovna, you know me, Raskolnikov. Here, I brought you the pledge I promised the other day." And he held out the pledge. The old woman glanced for a moment at the pledge, but at once stared in the eyes of her uninvited visitor. She looked intently, maliciously, and mistrustfully. A minute passed. He even fancied something like a sneer in her eyes, as though she had already guessed everything. He felt that he was losing his head, that he was almost frightened, so frightened that if she were to look like that and not say a word for another half-minute, he thought he would have to run away from her. "Why do you look at me as though you did not know me?" he said suddenly, also with malice. "Take it if you like. If not, I'll go elsewhere. I'm in a hurry." He'd not even thought of saying this, but it was suddenly said of itself. The old woman recovered herself, and her visitor's resolute tone evidently restored her confidence. "But why, my good sir, all of a minute? What is it?" she asked, looking at the pledge. A silver cigarette case. I spoke of it last time, you know." She held out her hand. "How pale you are, to be sure. Your hands are trembling, too. Have you been bathing, or what?" "A fever," he answered abruptly. "You can't help getting pale, if you've nothing to eat," he added, with difficulty articulating the words. His strength was failing him again, but his answer sounded like the truth. The old woman took the pledge. "What is it?" she asked once more, scanning Raskolnikov intently and weighing the pledge in her hand. A thing, cigarette case, silver. Look at it. Does not seem somehow like silver. How he has wrapped it up." Trying to untie the string and turning to the window, to the light, all her windows were shut in spite of the stifling heat, she left him altogether for some seconds and stood with her back to him. He unbuttoned his coat and freed the axe from the noose, but he did not yet take it out altogether, simply holding it in his right hand under the coat. His hands were fearfully weak. He felt them every moment growing more numb, more wooden. He was afraid he would let the axe slip and fall. Sudden giddiness came over him. "But what has he tied it up like this for?" the old woman cried with vexation and moved towards him. He had not a minute more to lose. He pulled the axe out, swung it with both arms, scarcely conscious of himself, and almost without effort, almost mechanically, brought the blunt side down on her head. He seemed not to use his own strength in this, but as soon as he had once brought the axe down, his strength returned. The old woman was, as always, bareheaded. Her thin, light hair, streaked with grey, thickly smeared with grease, was plaited in a rat's tail and fastened by a broken horn comb, which stood out on the very top of her skull. She cried out, but very faintly, and suddenly sank all of a heap on the floor, raising her hands to her head. In one hand she still held the pledge. Then he dealt her another and another blow with the blunt side, and on the same spot the blood gushed as from an overturned glass. The body fell back. He stepped back, let it fall, and at once bent over her face. She was dead. Her eyes seemed to be starting out of her sockets. The brow and the whole face were drawn and contorted convulsively. He laid the axe on the ground near the dead body and felt at once in her pocket, trying to avoid the seeming body. The same right-hand pocket from which she had taken the key on his last visit. He was in full possession of his faculties, free from confusion or giddiness, but his hands were still trembling. He remembered afterwards that he'd been particularly collected and careful, trying all the time not to get smeared with blood. He pulled out the keys at once. They were all, as before, in one bunch on a steel ring. He ran at once into the bedroom with them. It was a very small room, with a whole shrine of holy images. Against the other wall stood a big bed, very clean and covered with a silk patchwork wadded quilt. Against the third wall was a chest of drawers. Strange to say, so soon as he began to fit the keys into the chest, so soon as he heard their jingling, a convulsive shudder passed over him. He suddenly felt tempted again to give it all up and go away. But that was only for an instant. It was too late to go back. He positively smiled at himself when suddenly another terrifying idea occurred to his mind. He suddenly fancied that the old woman might be still alive and might recover her senses. Leaving the keys in the chest, he ran back to the body, snatched up the axe and lifted it once more over the woman's head, but did not bring it down. There was no doubt that she was dead. Bending down and examining her again more closely, he saw clearly that the skull was broken and even battered in on one side. He was about to feel it with his fingers, but drew back his hand, and indeed it was evident without that. Meanwhile, there was a perfect pool of blood. All at once he noticed a string on her neck. He tugged at it, but the string was strong, it did not snap, and besides, it was soaked with blood. He tried to pull it out from the front of the dress, but something held it and prevented its coming. In his impatience, he raised the axe again to cut the string from above on the body, but did not dare, and with difficulty, smearing his hand and the axe in the blood, after 2 minutes' hurried effort, he cut the string and took it off without touching the body with the axe. He was not mistaken. It was a purse. On the string were 2 crosses, one of cypress wood and one of copper, and an image in silver filigree, and with them a small, greasy, chamois leather purse with a steel rim and ring. The purse was stuffed very full. Raskolnikov thrust it in his pocket without looking at it, flung the crosses on the old woman's body, and rushed back into the bedroom, this time taking the axe with him. He suddenly heard steps in the room where the old woman lay, stopped short, and was still as death. But all was quiet, so it must have been his fancy. All at once he heard distinctly a faint cry, as though someone had uttered a low, broken moan. Then again, dead silence for a minute or two. He sat squatting on his heels by the box and waited, holding his breath. Suddenly he jumped up, seized the axe, and ran out of the bedroom. In the middle of the room stood Lizaveta with a big bundle in her arms. She was gazing in stupefaction at her murdered sister, white as a sheet and seeming not to have the strength to cry out. Seeing him run out of the bedroom, she began faintly quivering all over like a leaf. A shudder ran down her face. She lifted her hand, opened her mouth, but still did not scream. She began slowly backing away from him into the corner, staring intently, persistently at him, but still uttered no sound, as though she could not get breath to scream. He rushed at her with the axe. Her mouth twitched piteously, as one sees babies' mouths when they begin to be frightened, stare intently at what frightens them and are on the point of screaming. And this hapless Lizaveta was so simple and had been so thoroughly crushed and scared that she did not even raise her hand to guard her face, though that was the most necessary and natural action at the moment, for the axe was raised over her face. She only put her empty left hand, but not to her face, slowly holding it out before her as though motioning him away. The axe fell with a sharp edge just on the skull and split at one blow all the top of the head. She fell heavily at once. Raskolnikov completely lost his head, snatched up her bundle, dropped it again, and ran into the entry. Fear gained more and more mastery over him, especially after this second, quite unexpected murder. He longed to run away from the place as fast as possible. And if at that moment he'd been capable of seeing and reasoning more correctly, if he had been able to realize all the difficulties of his position, the hopelessness, the hideousness, and the absurdity of it, if he could have understood how many obstacles and perhaps crimes he had still to overcome or to commit to get out of that place and to make his way home, it is very possible that he would have flung up everything and would have gone to give himself up, and not from fear, but from simple horror and loathing of what he had done. The feeling of loathing especially surged up with him and grew stronger every minute. He would not now have gone to the box or even into the room for anything in the world. But a sort of blankness, even dreaminess, had begun by degrees to take possession of him. At moments he forgot himself, or rather forgot what was of importance, and caught at trifles. Glancing, however, into the kitchen and seeing a bucket half full of water on a bench, he bethought him of washing his hands and the axe. His hands were sticky with blood. He dropped the axe with the blade in the water, snatched a piece of soap that lay in a broken saucer on the window, and began washing his hands in the bucket. When they were clean, he took out the axe, washed the blade, and spent a long time, about 3 minutes, washing the wood where there were spots of blood, rubbing them with soap. Then he wiped it all with some linen that was hanging to dry on a line in the kitchen, and then he was a long while attentively examining the axe at the window. There was no trace left on it, only the wood was still damp. He carefully hung the axe in the noose under his coat. Then, as far as was possible in the dim light in the kitchen, he looked over his overcoat, his trousers, and his boots. At the first glance there seemed to be nothing but stains on the boots. He wetted the rag and rubbed the boots. But he knew he was not looking thoroughly, that there might be something quite noticeable that he was overlooking. He stood in the middle of the room, lost in thought. Dark, agonizing ideas rose in his mind. The idea that he was mad, and that at that moment he was incapable of reasoning or protecting himself, that he ought perhaps to be doing something utterly different from what he was doing now. Good God, he muttered, I must fly, fly. And he rushed into the entry. But here a shock of terror awaited him, such as he had never known before. He stood and gazed and could not believe his eyes. The door, the outer door from the stairs, at which he had not long before waited and rung, was standing unfastened and at least 6 inches open. No lock, no bolt, all the time, all that time. The old woman had not shut it after him, perhaps as a precaution. But good God, why he had seen Lizaveta afterwards, and how could he have failed to reflect that she must have come in somehow? He dashed to the door and fastened the latch. But no, the wrong thing again. I must get away, get away. He unfastened the latch, opened the door, and began listening on the staircase. Listened a long time. Somewhere far away, it might be in the gateway, 2 voices were loudly and shrilly shouting, quarreling and scolding. What are they about? He waited patiently. At last, all was still, as though suddenly cut off. They had separated. He was meaning to go out, but suddenly, on the floor below, a door noisily opened, and someone began going downstairs, humming a tune. How is it they all make such a noise? Flashed through his mind. Once more he closed the door and waited. At last, all was still, not a soul stirring. He was just taking a step towards the stairs when he heard fresh footsteps. The steps sounded very far off at the very bottom of the stairs, but he remembered quite clearly and distinctly that from the first sound he began for some reason to suspect that this was someone coming there to the 4th floor, to the old woman. Why? Were the sounds somehow peculiar, significant? The steps were heavy, even, and unhurried. Now he had passed the 1st floor. Now he was mounting higher. It was growing more and more distinct. He could hear his heavy breathing. Now the 3rd floor had been reached.